I know.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the University of Maryland and the Department of Communication. My name is Sean Perry Giles, and I'm the director of the Mark and Heather Rosenker Center for Political Communication and Civic Leadership, and I'm also the chair of the Department of Communication. I especially want to thank our featured speakers, the Honorable David Goodfriend, and then Brad Blakewell. Thank you so much for coming. Blakeman, I'm sorry. We want to welcome our guests also who come to the university for the first time, and those alums who come back and are visiting us for this important event. And welcome to students, faculty, and staff here at the university and other members of the community. We're here tonight to launch the first Rosenker lecture, Mark and Heather Rosenker lecture, so we're very excited about that. The Rosenker lecture is part of our Rosenker Center, which is a nonpartisan center that's designed to bring students together with members of the community to deliberate over pressing issues that impact our campus, our community, and the larger world. The lecture series in particular is designed to work on issues of deliberation that foster productive communication across divisive issues. Holding this discussion now is particularly salient given the discord that we've just experienced over the Kavanaugh hearings, and we're getting ready to head to the polls, so you've probably already sent in your absentee ballots. We have competing predictions about whether or not people will actually turn out for the midterm elections more than often they do, and there's some believe that we'll have high turnout, and some believe that it's actually going to remain rather depressed. Only some 35% of youth vote are expected to turn out for those between 18 and 29 years of age. And as the election nears, people talk about feeling very estranged from their country. The New York Times did a poll, and 47% of voters who approve of President Trump said that they feel detached from their country, and 44% of those who disapprove of President Trump say they feel detached from their country. So people from the coal mines, West Virginia, to the suburbs of Orange County, California, express similar feelings about politics today and their government. The U.S. politics is becoming, the talk about U.S. politics is becoming increasingly incendiary. Politics has always been incendiary, and the language about politics is conflated with war. But the Rasmussen report from the summer indicates that some 30% believe that we're going to have a civil war in this country in the next 5 years. And pundits and political leaders are talking about us in terms of tribal politics. So you can't get much more divisive than civil war and tribalism. But in spite of all that, I think there is hope, and I think it's important for us to look for hope. I was very heartened by the fact when we were planning the event, I reached out to both the organizations on campus, the Democratic group, the Democratic Party here on campus, the Student Party, as well as the College Republicans. And what was really heartening for me is that it was clear that these groups do talk across one another. We were talking about what to do to help with the voting drive, and it's clear they've been in touch and they work together commonly. And I think this is going to be you as the next generation to determine whether or not this is the status quo of this divisiveness, or whether or not you can change these rather destructive patterns. And our speakers tonight, I think, also bring a sense of hope to us because they offer insight for how to work across the political divide. They do it every day and have done so for years. So despite such deep fractures, they remain believers in the importance of public service. Many students report that public service, that they're not interested in public service, especially if it involves working in government. And I think our guest speakers and also the Rosenkers have shown and have devoted their life to public service. And we thank them for coming and for sharing their time with us. So once we're going to proceed, and once we have the presenters finish their discussion, then you will have time for questions. There are mics here. We hope that as you're listening, you'll think about comments that you'd like to make, as well as raise questions for the speakers. But before we give our proper introductions of our guest speakers, I would like to introduce Heather Rosenker, who's also going to then introduce Mark Rosenker. Our center is named after the Rosenkers, and we are very pleased that it is because they've been such great supporters of the University of Maryland and our department in particular. Heather Rosenker is president and founder of HBR and Associates. It's a public relations firm, and she works in public relations, crisis communication, as well as strategic communication. Throughout her career, she's worked on various projects related to the Department of Homeland Security involving FEMA and ICE. She's also worked for the George H.W. Bush administration's Council on Environmental Quality. And she served as the Executive Director of the Federal Advisory Commission on Electronic Commerce, which is a group created by Congress. Heather Rosenker is not a graduate of the University of Maryland. She graduated from the University of Denver.
Go right here.
But we still consider her an honorary terp and honorary member of our department.
Good evening, and hello to all of you in Cyberland, since we are streaming this. Thank you all for coming. This is a great turnout, and we're really thrilled. And thank you both to Brad and David for being our first speakers in our lecture series. Civility, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is courteous politeness, a polite act or expression. Pretty obvious, you probably all know that. But I bet you would agree that we should all be courteous and civil, whether we're talking about the movie we saw last weekend or about the next gubernatorial, senatorial, or presidential race. And given that this center, its purpose is to promote communication across political differences, today's topic is more than relevant. In the world we live in today, there is considerable hype, and Sean actually mentioned it, that the world is heading toward a period of civil unrest. I don't believe that. I have hope. And instead, I believe that our problem is mostly a lack of simple civility. Stepping back and understanding how we interact with each other and how we should be polite to each other. Political talk has become heated, and especially because of social media, when we all have access, including each of you, have your phones with you, your little computer, so the moment any of us up here say something that you might disagree with, you'll be tweeting. But let's think about this for a minute. We all have a responsibility because we have those computers and that ability to reach out, and in some cases, of course, be anonymous, so it's easy to be hateful and ugly when we can be anonymous. But even if you were doing it, think about it the next time. The responsibility is ours. We're the ones who can change the civility. Don't tweet. Don't make a negative comment. Think about it. We can all change it because it's our behavior. And the only thing we can control is our behavior. So give that some thought. There was an editorial that was passed around to some regional newspapers, so they all published it. So if you Googled it, there were like 7 different regional papers that covered it. And they talked about this, and they said, you know, we're not in a civil unrest. Think about the 60s and 70s. And in the 60s and 70s, there were bomb threats. There was the Weather Underground. There was Black Panthers. The Ku Klux Klan was still around. So we've certainly moved on from that. So let's have hope, and let's all work to get to the right place and a better place. As I said, this opportunity requires greater responsibility from each and every one of us. And basically, think about putting the mute button on. This is the first of many lectures in our series, and we hope that you guys will return again. I hope you find it provocative and interesting. And please reach out to anyone and yourselves, introduce yourselves, and let's all work together to make this happen. It is my pleasure now to introduce my husband, Mark Rosenker, who is a 1969 graduate of this great university. He was commissioned in the U.S. Air Force as a second lieutenant, and he participated in Maryland's ROTC, Air Force ROTC program. And he retired after 36 years of service, both active duty and reserve, as a Major General. He served 6 presidents of the United States. In some ways, he was in some positions, he was actually in the White House. President George W. Bush appointed him to be the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, where he stayed for 7 years. Today, he sits on several corporate boards. He runs his own consulting company, and he's CBS News' on-air transportation safety analyst. Pitch, watch CBS Evening News. If you watched it last night, you would have seen Mark, because he was on, talking about the First Lady's airplane that had smoke in it. Transportation safety issue. He's also the vice chairman of the brand new Metro Rail Safety Commission that the whole tri-state area has developed. And with that, I present my husband, Mark.
Absolutely
accurate and very warm introduction. Make me feel like I'm somebody. It's been about 50 years since I've really spent a lot of time on this campus. 69. I'm not even sure if my math is right. It could be more than that. Help me out, Tim, on that. You're a PhD. You can figure those things out.
1859.
1859. So when I was here, though, I don't think this sign is still around. Right on Route 1, there was a billboard. And it said, Dr. Dennis Levinson, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and Taxidermy. His slogan was, either way you get your dog back. Either way you get your... Okay. Delighted that all of you have come to be part of this first lecture series at the Rosenker Center. We today have some absolutely incredible speakers. We are gifted to be able to have these two gentlemen with us. You've seen them on television. They have been on Fox. They go to CNN. They go to MSNBC. They are routine players because they are so well known and so respected in political circles in Washington, D.C. I've known one of them for, 20, almost 40 years. He was around since Teddy Roosevelt. People think I was around since Lincoln. So it's not true. I only go back as far as Nixon. Nixon, you've read about him in the history books, right? Remember that? What are they teaching now, Professor? What are they teaching? Okay, well, I just want to say a little about each one of these people. Bradley Blakeman. Brad and I worked together in the White House. He is a recovering lawyer. And when he and I were in the White House, actually we started working together back in the 80s as advancemen for Ronald Reagan. And we went through Reagan, we ended up with George H.W. Bush. He was an appointee to the National Holocaust Commission. It was brand new and he was one of the first commissioners of the museum. He is a man who has actually been around doing this for many years. He, after the 2000 election, was sent down for the recount, to help in the recount. This was obviously a very contentious kind of a situation. I think he started what they called the Brooks Brothers riot. The Brooks Brothers riot were all these rioters, but they were all in ties, blue blazers, and then they only stayed for a little while and then went to lunch. That was part of the recount. He played such an important role in that recount that he ended up getting a part in the HBO movie called Recount. So if you don't like what he has to say today, you'll like what he did in the Recount movie, so just go and watch that. It's on YouTube and Google and all that stuff. So Brad Blakeman, Recount, we got a movie star in our hands. Our other colleague is David Goodfriend. David is an articulate, spirited, brilliant political operative. A man who has worked, he also is a lawyer, a recovering lawyer I might add, at Georgetown University grad. And he worked on Capitol Hill for a number of senators and Charlie Rangel as a member of the House. He, in government, was at the FCC as a special advisor to Commissioner Susan Ness. He actually was on the senior staff of Bill Clinton as the Deputy Staff Secretary. That is a huge job. That person, every single document that the President of the United States sees, David would see it first before it was brought to the Oval Office. A very, very important job. Brad worked in the White House too. I forgot to tell you that he was the Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Scheduling for the President. He spent a lot of time in the Oval Office trying to explain to the President why there were certain things that he needed to do, and the President said, "Do I really have to do this?" I said, "Mr. President, you can do whatever you want." He says, "Then no, I won't do it." So Brad would have to go back and change the schedule routinely because sometimes the President just did what he wanted to do. let me just, again, welcome all of you folks to this first lecture. We are so, again, proud to have Brad and David. And before I go any further, let me say this. 50-some years ago, I was sitting in the seats like you're sitting in right now. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever, while I was going to this university, believe that I would, one, graduate, and then two, be honored to have our name on a center here at this university. So let me just tell you this. I know there are people out here that are probably Phi Beta Kappa. I know there are people that are sitting in this audience that are probably cum laude. But let me also tell you, there are people with C averages that are sitting in these seats. And someday maybe you too can have your name down at the Rosenker Center. Brad, David.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Heather. This is the first lecture. It might be the last if we don't do a good job. So we'll try and do as good a job as we can. Let me tell you, I worked for 3 White Houses. David worked for 1. We were members of senior staffs for different presidents with different abilities, different temperaments, different parties. But there's a lot of commonality in what we do. And I wanted to say that the first time I met David was debating him on television. And anybody see the Coyote and the Roadrunner? That's what it is. It's the Coyote and the Roadrunner. And when 5 o'clock comes, we're friends. But while we're sitting in the chair or sitting in the green room, we are adversaries. And that's not a bad thing. We're both lawyers. I practiced law for 13 years. We call it during the dark period when the Clintons were in power. When George H.W. Bush was defeated. So I went back and I practiced law and I was on trials and not personally representing clients. But David and I met in the green rooms, and then we would come out after battling each other on television and we'd strike up conversations. He'd talk about his family, I'd talk about mine, we'd talk about business. And then we had a great idea. Well, why don't we make something out of this as a business? So we formed the 1600 group, and David will tell you a little bit about what our business does, and through that I think you'll understand that in Washington perhaps it's hyperbolic, the rhetoric, but it takes 2 to tango. And it probably will take 2 to tango for the foreseeable future. And that's a good thing. The problem is when you're not the Coyote and the Roadrunner, 5 o'clock comes around, it never ends. It never ceases. And you can have civil conversations. Many times when I will appear on television or I'll be talking to people on my side of the aisle, they'll lecture me that, you know, whatever you do, we can't compromise on this. And then I said to him, I said, wait a second. I said, are you married? Yeah. Well, do you compromise with your wife? Yeah. I said, well, you run a business. Do you compromise in business? Yeah. I said, so why should politics be any different than the compromises you have to make every day in your personal life and your professional life? Compromise is a necessary part. We do it every day. Sometimes we don't even think about the compromises we make. And sometimes we have to think long and hard about the compromises we make. But if you stand on principle, and you're fair, you're honest, you're open, you can have disagreements. But at the end of the day, the mission is the same. The commonality of interest. We are Americans, first and foremost. And that's the thing that should bind us all. And we can have disagreements on policy, we can have disagreements on legislation, but everybody needs to give something. And if you're willing to give something without giving up principle, then you're moving the ball ahead, you're advancing. And if you stand on principle without conviction, that this is the way you have, it's my way or the highway, well, nothing will ever get done. And gridlock is probably one of the worst forms of representation when nothing gets done, because we can solve any problem. David and I have sat down with clients who, for a Republican walking in to this building, I didn't even think I was allowed. And at the end of the day, they understood that it does take 2 to tango. that, you know, half a loaf sometimes is better than no loaf at all. And with your permission, before we get to David, to prove my point, I'd like to do a magic trick. Is a magic trick okay?
Good.
But I need an assistant.
Want me to help you?
Yes,
Or
Heather.
you want to
Heather.
pick somebody from the
Heather,
audience?
Heather.
Oh, this is cute.
Required writing.
I'm disappearing.
Now, it took me a long time.
You better spell for me. I'm bad at that.
It took me a long time to figure out. I have 10 principles of leadership. And it took me a long time to get those 10 principles. But here's the trick. We just met, right? I don't know you. You don't know me. But I will guarantee you that my 10 principles of leadership, which have taken me decades to come to, and every decision I make, I go back to those principles, whether it's in business or family. If it's a big decision, I always go back to my 10 principles, which keep me from making a bad decision and ground you. You always have to be grounded to remember, A, where you come from, B, where you want to go. But everybody has the same mission. So I won't give you my 10 until I hear your 10. But somebody give me number one. What's a principle of leadership?
Good communication.
Communication. That's what? Coming from the School of Communications. I'll turn on my phone and get mine. Next. Yes, sir.
Commitment to integrity.
Integrity. Next one. Yes, sir.
Ability to produce incentives and decentives.
Incentive.
Incentive?
Incentive
Okay. Who's got the next one?
Vision,
Vision. Okay.
negotiation.
Negotiation. Heather, you keeping up?
Yes.
Well, we're at 5. Negotiate 6.
Patience.
What?
Patience.
Patience.
Yeah.
Okay. Patience.
It's not right or
I
wrong.
was being impatient.
Efficiency.
Efficiency. That's 7.
Yeah.
8.
Honesty. Honesty.
Honesty. Okay.
I guess
See, honesty is 8.
Thank you.
9. Yes, ma'am.
Taking care of your team.
Take care of your team, she said.
Teamwork. And 10.
Smart.
Smart. Helps to be smart. Okay, we just met. You just gave me 10 principles of leadership. There they are, and now I'm going to give you mine.
Do I have to write those down too?
No, but you'll
I'm
see.
happy to.
Okay, right now.
Just asking.
Honesty.
It's down there, it's number 8.
Yeah.
No,
Great.
no, this is mine.
I wanted to check them all.
Right.
Marrying off here. We're-
Vision.
Oh.
Oh,
Now it's getting scary, right?
Yeah.
Good.
Integrity.
oh, there's 2 up there.
This is insane. Inclusiveness. Can be teamwork.
Teamwork.
Inspiration. Loyalty. Now this one's kind of weird, but risk. No risk, no reward. Success. Nobody who's ever accomplished anything didn't risk something to get something. Failure. Failure is a necessary component of success. Nobody's ever succeeded without failure. And 10, most important, compromise. Those are my 10. We just met. I think there's a lot of synergy between what you just gave me and what took me years to to hone and to make sure that anything I do, whether it's in business or family, always stays true to those 10 objectives. And if you do, then the chances of making a bad decision have been reduced. And you're also almost guaranteeing yourself that you've thought it through. And when I teach at Georgetown University, another fine university, and what I do with my students is we have debates. But I make my students take both sides of the argument. So on one day they have to take a pro side, and the next day, or the next week, they have to take the opposite. You can never be successful communicators by just advancing your side. You have to appreciate the other side. You have to know what they're capable of, what they've done, what they're likely to do. You have to understand their argument. If you go in just with your own argument, you've lost. You have to be patient enough, you have to be deliberate enough, you have to be open enough to understand where the other person is coming from. Now, you may not agree with them, but as a trial lawyer, as somebody who worked in governments, as somebody who worked in communications, as somebody who works in academia, I'm always open to the other person's argument. Doesn't mean I have to accept it. But if I understand where they're coming from, and I can digest it, I will have a better opportunity in advancing what I would like to do. And it also makes you open to compromise, because you see the weaknesses of your own points. And the goal in life is to make decisions, and make good decisions, and advance the ball. There's a guy who lives in Virginia. How many people know who Bill Gates is? How many people know who Zuckerberg is? How many people know who Dr. Robert Kahn is? What if I told you rather Zuckerberg or Gates wouldn't be anybody without Dr. Kahn? A little guy who lives in Reston, Virginia. He developed the internet, which was an intranet at DARPA at the Pentagon in the 60s. Nobody knows who this guy is. If you walk in this room, you think he's an old Jewish accountant. And yet, he changed the world. And when I asked him, I said, Dr. Kahn, how many times did you fail? He says, I can't tell you how many times I failed. I said, well, what kept you going? He said, the possibility of success. So, a good communicator is one who knows their own points, who can appreciate the opposition's point, who's not afraid to fail, who's not afraid to risk, not afraid to state a principle, and not afraid to advance. With that, thank you, Brad.
Well, I just want to start off by congratulating and thanking once again General Rosenker and Heather Rosenker. Let's give them another round of applause. Great Maryland graduates. So before I say another word, I want you to raise your hand if you're an undergraduate student here at Maryland. Okay. Now, I have a son who's a junior in college, and I want you to raise your hand if you promise to email or call your parents tonight. Raise your hand if you promise to email or call your parents tonight. All right, I'm holding you to it. We love to hear from you. I don't care how close your parents live. When that phone rings and it's our son calling, you would laugh out loud watching my wife and I trip over each other and get the phone and talk to our son. Call your parents. All right, that's enough for the public service announcement. So I'm often asked by my fellow progressives or fellow Democrats, how do you do it? How do you go on Fox News as the only progressive sitting in between the anchor or the host who is conservative politically, and on the other side, Brad Blakeman or some other avowed conservative? How do you do it? And I say, well,
Alcohol.
After the alcohol, have you ever gone to a family member's home for a meal? Maybe it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah or something, and the host, your uncle or your grandpa or somebody else, has some pretty different political views to your own. We've all been there. I know you've been there. Okay? Uncle Bill who keeps a mounted deer head on the wall and a 45 under his bed, is going to tell you about how conservatives are the only people who are right. But your job is to come to the dinner table and have a good family dinner. So, you're still going to say, please pass the salt, Uncle Bill. And Uncle Bill will pass you the salt, and you'll have a conversation over dinner. That's how I try to explain to people what it's like to go on to Fox News as a self-described progressive Democrat and have a conversation. Now, how do I lose for sure? The way I lose in that setting is by getting upset and yelling and looking like the caricature of the wild-eyed, crazy liberal. That is a surefire way to lose. Believe me, there are many times I want to yell and look exactly like the wild-eyed, crazy liberal, but I keep it down. And I say, you know what, Brad? That's a pretty good point you just made. I kind of understand why you might be upset about that. You're communicators, so let's start taking that apart. I'm acknowledging the humanity of the person who just spoke. I'm not treating them like they are some sort of Martian with four heads. I also am acknowledging the emotion behind what they might have said. In other words, I may very much disagree with the content of the statement or the policy that's being supported, but I will gladly acknowledge that you are justified in feeling the way you feel in order to get you to that space. And also what I've done is slightly disarming. I think it's really an effective way to communicate with somebody you disagree with, be disarming. Hey, Brad, nice tie. Now here's why I disagree. It's very effective, and it also allows the recipient of your views to see you as human, to see you as rational, reasonable, and you haven't detracted at all from your own beliefs, your own passion, your own stance. I think that's extremely important in the work that we do. If we're going to persuade, we don't persuade by saying to somebody, you idiot, you moron, you jerk, even though that might be what we're thinking. We don't say that because that's not how you persuade. And it's certainly not how you win in a debate setting. So what would I say next? Well, I do have a few tried and true cards I love to play. You know, as Ronald Reagan once said, I'll let that hang there for a while.
Well, I knew Ronald Reagan. You weren't no Ronald.
Well, that's true. But if I say, as Ronald Reagan once said, no one's going to interrupt that. We need immigration reform. He did. As Ronald Reagan once said, you fill in the blank. Or sometimes I'll say, there's a Republican senator from Tennessee who says our immigration is broke, and he happens to chair the Foreign Relations Committee. So another, I think, really important tactic to talking to somebody you disagree with is find something somewhere that someone who they might agree with said where you can meet. Let's start there. We can meet there. Brad, or whoever it is, Uncle Bill. I've got an idea. I think we can actually see eye to eye that there's a person you support and you like who said something you actually have to hear. These are all different ways, I believe, of getting in to someone who is not in the mood to listen to you and saying, we actually can have a conversation here. Now, Brad mentioned this, and I think it's also worth pointing out. We run a business together. Maybe someday some of you will start a business. But if you want to really learn what trust means, try trusting somebody else with your money. Okay? We have clients. Some of them are big, some of them are small. But they only send in one check. And sometimes it goes into Brad's mailbox, and sometimes it goes into my mailbox. And we just, without talking to each other, know that the other person is going to deposit that check. And then one of us has the job of going into the bank account and paying both of us. In other words, money comes in and we divide it, 50-50. You want to really learn how to trust somebody, run a business together, and share in the duty of receiving and dispersing money. That sounds so simple and so, I don't know, maybe low compared to the high-minded policy debates that go on in Washington all the time. But I would argue that those simple acts of shared destiny really are what make us a country, if you add it all up. When General Rosenker is in the military, I think he'll tell you that in a foxhole there are no atheists and no political parties. Everybody's in it together, and they have a common goal. It's rare, but important, to find the ways in which you work with someone and disagree with them, but you share a common goal. I do believe that the statements of our nation being ripped apart at the seams and being on the verge of civil war are overstated because we are so interdependent. I love going to California and seeing what the progressive nirvana looks like. The fifth largest economy in the world, and all kinds of great civil rights and labor protection laws and a booming economy. Okay, there are earthquakes and fires, I gotta look at traffic, whatever. But it's a great place to go. But by the same token, I really have learned a lot when I go to Texas, or when I go to Georgia, or other states that are decidedly less politically progressive. We ought to be able to find a way to relate to each other, to disarm each other, to be friendly enough and to trust each other, so that even when we disagree, which we will, we can find that common ground and find a way to communicate with each other. So, with that, I think we ought to open it up to questions. Everybody?
Sure, sure.
Who wants to ask questions? The mic, oh, there are microphones here and here, and anybody should be able to grab a microphone, pass it down to someone else. I guess raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll try to get you one. No questions, we answered everything you want to know. Just got it. Ah, there's a question right there. Do you want to stand up, sir, and come to the microphone, or do you want to hand the microphone over? Is that easier? Yeah, help each other out. See, you two don't even know whether or not you share the same views, but you're going to help him get a microphone.
All right, so I was curious about you guys' business. Could you talk about the war, how you guys got started?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. So, as Brad mentioned, both of us are lawyers. Both of us do advocacy in Washington, meaning we get hired by clients to have a change in the law or to have a transaction approved or blocked. Anytime there's a government action, anytime there's an intersection between public policy and business or labor or any of the other entities that hire us. So part of that also involves communication. Let me give you an example. Now, I don't want to name names of clients, but we have done work for a major labor union. And this labor union was concerned that when a court issued a ruling, conservatives would claim that it was political payback for the Obama administration's receiving support from the union. Political support. Brad went to a prominent Republican, retired, but someone who had held office, brought the legal team with him, and briefed this prominent Republican on the case. All right, the judge issues an opinion, and within minutes, this prominent Republican comes forward and says, I support this. I support this. I had a real hand in setting the stage for the case, but I support this decision. The union deserves this decision. Not a single Republican from sea to shining sea said boo. And the labor union was really happy with our work. We still work for them to this day. Now, we've done work for companies, we've done work for nonprofits. But what's interesting about that story, and what I want you to understand, the reason why we get hired is because we don't pretend to be middle of the road bipartisan. I am an avowed progressive Democrat on the left. Brad is a committed conservative Republican on the right. But the clients that we represent need things from both sides. It's up to us to make the case, me to the left, Brad to the right, as to why that fits the political narrative. And it always works. Now think about that for a second. Regardless of who the client is, there's always an argument on the left that works, and there's an argument on the right that works. But the people on the left aren't going to listen to him, and people on the right aren't going to listen to me. We split up the tasks. He goes that way, I go that way. We make the case. It works. That should tell you something about shared interest and commonality in the United States today. That the outcome may be the same. It may be the desired outcome is exactly the same. But the arguments you make and the way you get there politically could be diametrically different. But you end up in the same place.
When the union actually was open enough to speak to a Republican, I laid my cards on the table. I said, you know what? It's worth a shot. And we have nothing to lose. So why don't we be as open and honest with the right, tell them what's coming down, seek their support, give them reasons why, and let's see if we can blunt the kind of adversarial response that the right would have if ordinarily. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. The left does something, the right's got to do something. Well, not all the time. There are ways to blunt it. There's a way to get half a loaf. And when I went to this prominent Republican, he was very happy to get some inside information before it actually was made public, and to get his thoughts, and that we were willing to seek his advice. And at the end of the day, when we needed him, he stepped up to the plate and got nothing in return, other than it was the right thing to do. And the union was very happy. Another success story is another union had what I perceived to be a terrible slogan, and it was war on workers, and that was their slogan. And it's very negative. So here the Republican comes in and says, you know what, bad slogan. I said, if you want Republican support, why don't you do something that everybody can agree with? And so we came up with a different slogan. Let's get America working. Build, maintain, repair. So anybody who we communicate it to, how can you be against putting America to work? How can you be against building, maintaining, and repairing infrastructure? So when we were pushing for infrastructure, we changed their messaging. And their members felt good about it because they had a positive message. So it's not always what you say, it's sometimes how you say it too. And in Washington, there are lobby firms years ago used to be either Republican or Democrat. And the two could be working for the same client, but they never talk to each other. Now, what's developing, and I think is happening more and more, is the type of relationship that we have. A Republican and Democrat working together for the common interest of the client. Sometimes David has to step on the gas more than I would because of the issue. Sometimes I have to do it. But there's always a receptive argument that can be made to both sides, either to blunt something or to advance something. In Washington, in life, there are always people against something. I'll give you an example. Edison invented the light bulb, did he not? Who do you think was against the light bulb?
Candle makers.
The candle makers. And the kerosene baron, whose name was John D. Rockefeller, owned a crap load of kerosene. And he didn't want to see himself have to change his business model. And what he threw away as a byproduct of kerosene was gasoline. So he switched businesses as the automobile came up and made a fantastic living getting rid of kerosene and being an oil baron in gasoline. But the moral of the story is, in order for Edison to advance his electricity, he needed a public-private partnership. He needed government. And I will submit to you there's never been anything big taken on by government that is without a public-private partnership. The public is as necessary as the private sector. So what did Edison want out of the government? He needed easements and licenses for telephone poles on lands he didn't own, and string wires to reach houses and businesses. So that required a lobbying effort. That required government approval. That required people like us to make a case. And in order to make an effective case and be an effective communicator, you have to be able to understand who you're communicating to, what your goals and objectives are, and understand that both of us are going to be successful for the client. Now, it may take more work on his side, it may take more work on my side, but the end goal is the same, and that's to advance the successes for the client. And we maintained and grew our business based on the success model of working together and understanding. There are no secrets. He tells me what he's going to do, what calls he's going to make to senators and congressmen, and I don't go and play my points with my side by saying, hey, I know that a call is going to come into Senator so-and-so. No. We work together for the common goal of the client. And it's been very effective. And I think it's a model we're going to see more and more of. I hope we do in Washington and beyond, because working together is a heck of a lot better. And it ain't a bad living, by the way. So the main thing is you don't have to lose respect. You don't have to sell yourself out, your principles and your goals and objectives as a person, as a professional, by working together to advance the goals of a client or advance the goals of a country.
Any other questions? I thought I saw another hand. Yeah. Oh. He's got the mic.
My question is, how do you recommend talking across party lines around concepts like voter suppression in Georgia?
Thank you. It's a great question. First thing I'll say is that if you don't vote, you're part of the problem. If you don't vote, you're part of the problem. I get a lump in my throat every time I go to the polls. I know that sounds sappy and kind of corny, but people actually died for my right and your right to go vote. Now, by the same token, people also died here in the United States trying to vote. I believe that voter suppression is one of the great evils of our times, and it's been around for a long time. And I think the real essence of your question is, if I feel that way, how can I have a civil conversation with someone who I believe is actively trying to suppress votes? Well, it's hard. I think that's the point. There are places where we're going to disagree so vehemently that the easy answer would be, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you. So instead what I'd like to do is fight as best I can by the rules to make sure people can vote. One of my neighbors is a lawyer who represented the ACLU in front of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and as you probably know, that resulted in a decision to redraw the congressional lines in Pennsylvania. Now that's a fair fight, I think that's a fair fight. To the opponents who argued on the other side, I disagree with them. But if I'm sitting at that table on Thanksgiving with them, do I call them all kinds of names, or do I say, please pass the salt? I mean, this is the essence of what it means to have civil discourse. I have to be able to say, in the same breath, I completely disagree with you on the issue of voter suppression or redistricting or whatever, but I'm still going to have you over to my house for the holidays, which I've had Brad over to my house for the holidays many times. How do we get past that? I mean, your question is the right question. I was waiting for somebody to ask it. I'm glad you asked it, which is, are there things that Brad feels passionately about that I believe the opposite? Of course there are. Are there things that I feel passionately about and Brad feels the opposite? This may not be one of them. I don't want to indicate that. But of course there are. So a fair fight to me is we're not resorting to violence and we're not breaking existing law, even if I believe existing law is unjust. Civil disobedience is a proud part of our nation's history. Laws have been deliberately broken in order to make a point, and they've changed for the better. I believe in it. But I'm still going to say, in front of this audience at this moment, activism within the bounds of law and without violence are still, I think, the right way to forward a cause. Oh, and by the way, we had amazing voter turnout 2 elections in a row in 2008 and 2012, well above what anybody had estimated, because people on my side played by the rules and did a pretty good job. Good candidate, good message, good activism. So, yeah, voter suppression is an evil, I believe. And it's cowardly, because, frankly, and I'll just, I think I'll put this out there. If you believe in your own argument and you believe in your own persuasiveness, you should welcome as many voters as you can possibly get, because you're going to persuade them to vote for you. That's the right way to play by the rules. But I still say to you, my friend, if you come across somebody who thinks that what's going on in Georgia is okay, buy them a beer and sit down and talk to them and let them see the beauty and rationality of your argument rather than disengage altogether. Make sense?
Let me say a word about voting. Being somebody who experienced a recount for 37 days, like 48 minutes, we haven't learned anything as a national election since the recount. As painful as that episode was, where the Supreme Court had to ultimately decide the national election. I've written about it. I think that we need federal standards in national elections for all 50 states. I think it's ridiculous. Now, states can run their own statewide elections, local elections, more power to them, but I think we lose credibility as in national elections when there aren't uniform voting standards. And the standards are so different, like night and day, Georgia and every other state. It's just, in my opinion, if we made federal standards the gold standard, then states and local municipalities would follow it, but why wouldn't they? Because it works. And I think that's what I think we could find bipartisan support for. And also campaign finance reform. I got a lot of heat from the right. I wrote a blistering editorial about campaign finance reform. As a Republican, I got a lot of blowback because I suggested that the money should follow your vote. If you can't vote for somebody, you can't give money to them. And why is my congressman in Virginia and Michigan raising money? I don't see any reason. The Constitution fixes my representative at 700,000 constituents. And by the way, they're not at some rich guy's house in Michigan. So I think when we get back to basics and use common sense, we're much better off as a country, and the solutions are there. It's the will to get it done. And if it's bad for me, it's bad for him too.
Right, and by the way, I want to take this opportunity to say, I hope you will argue just as vehemently that a conservative should have the right to speak at this university as you would arguing that voter suppression is bad. They are equally offensive to me. It should be to you. In other words, disagree with him or disagree with me all you want, but don't try to shut down the speech altogether. Don't try to shut down the dialogue. Disagree with a candidate all you want, but don't try to shut down the vote. They fit together, and they even come from the same document, the Constitution. So I'm a big proponent of seeing progressives be consistent in these arguments about fairness. That gives us more credibility. All right, so people are getting antsy. I see them leaving. We got a question down here.
So this is one of those Thanksgiving dinner questions. I'm at a weekend with people I've known for over 40 years, and all women. And so, of course, the conversation is going towards the Kavanaugh hearing. And I'm expressing my opinion, okay? And I am surprised at how quiet some of the others are, so clearly they're not agreeing with me. And, but at one point in time, and I realized right after it happened that, wow, that's happened to me like 2 or 3 times in the last couple of years with long-term people who I met. I get the label, the L label. Well, you're a liberal. And you know, and I immediately want to respond. I'm a registered independent. I've always been a registered independent. I'm an informed voter. I vote for both Democrats and Republicans. And then, you know, and I get defensive. So I want to know, that's you know, like you're my little support group for the evening. I want to know, what do I say in response to the label, I don't want to hear?
Guess that one's for me. Well, let's try this. Okay, if that's what you want to call me. Okay, I'm a liberal. I just think that blah, 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 blah. You fill in the line. Don't let yourself be captive to a label. You know, I think race and gender and LGBTQ labels are confining because they assume that a person's only capable of existing within that. And it's restrictive. So are political labels too. Oh, you're a liberal. That must mean all these beliefs are yours. I don't even have to ask you what you really think. So I'd say diminish the label. Hi, you want to call me that? Okay, just don't call me late for dinner. And let's go on and talk about the next thing. Brad, do you have anything to add to that?
I would come back to your house.
That's not the message. Stay on message, Brad.
Okay. Look, if you're comfortable enough in your beliefs, then it really doesn't matter what other people. I've had some really, I've been called a rhino. That, you know what that is, right? Republican name only. But, and I've been called a lot worse that I won't repeat here, by people I thought were my friends, or because I would not debase an argument, or I would take the bait that they were throwing out, where they would order me to say something or do something that I didn't believe in. Many times I get a call from news sources, and they'll say, we're going to come on and talk about this. And I'll say, you know, I'm not the right person. Find somebody else. And you can only go so far with people. I never take the bait when people want to be uncivil. And the best thing to do when that happens is walk away. Because don't lower yourself to other people. You try and talk and give a reason, give an argument. I tell my students when they have an opinion, they'll say, well, I believe this. And I'll say, well, why? Tell me why. And some of the best arguments I've heard from my students are, and some of the best papers I've ever graded, were well thought out papers that I totally disagreed with on policy. But they were well thought out, and they were cited, and they were thoughtful. And it opened up my mind to their argument. Now, did it persuade me? No. But it gave me fodder. It made me smarter. And then I've had some students come. I won't talk politics in the classroom. So during my office hour, they come and they talk politics. But I've had a couple of students try and bait me in the classroom. Well, President Trump said this. You know, what do you think? I'll say, come and see me during my office hour. But I'm not. I don't see teaching. I don't see opportunity to communicate with others as proselytizing my beliefs or holding an audience captive. I learn more from my students than they'll ever get from me. And it's just the ability to listen and to accept their argument, provided that it's soundly thought through. But Republicans don't have the best ideas. Democrats don't have the best ideas. When they come together, that's when you have typically a great idea.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll call it. Well, while there's a question down here, and while the microphone's going in there, the only other thing I'll add is that's a great moment to acknowledge someone's emotion, right? If they say to you, "Oh, you're just a conservative," or "just a liberal," try this on for size. I can understand why you feel frustrated. I don't blame you for feeling that. I feel frustrated too. You think we ought to do this, and I think we ought to do that, but the feeling is justified. That's a great way to find commonality, even when you're disagreeing.
And if you're really ticked off, you say, in our country, the beautiful thing is everybody has a right to be wrong.
Last question.
So we live in a time where Trump is launching a rhetorical campaign on the media. There's lots of good statistics and polls about how voters are receiving limited and potential very biased media. especially young people with social media platforms. So what is your advice to remaining educated and navigating this system so we can best inform our voting decisions?
Great question. You want to start, Brad?
You know, people tend to be tribal today, and they tend to only get their news, or it's become very cliquish, from just a handful of sources. If you really want to be open about it, broaden your horizons. Read things you ordinarily wouldn't read. Listen to people, go to lectures, go to clubs, and listen to the other person's argument. It doesn't mean that you have to accept it, but it's a better way to understand it. Now, I'm a big supporter of the president. I'm friends with the president. I saw him last Tuesday, and as much as David hates him. And now, here's what I'll say about the president. There are some things that I wish he just wouldn't say. Now, do I like what he does? It's results versus rhetoric. That's the way I look at it. Results versus rhetoric. I'd like to see him tone down the rhetoric, but I certainly like the results. And in a town where, you know, I've served with politicians who can't get out of bed if the polls are bad. You know, they put their, or what does the press say? One thing about President Trump, he doesn't care what the press says. Now, for the first time in a long time, we have a leader, in my opinion, who's challenged the third rail. And it's gone to such an extreme that it's shocked us. Now, the good news, depending for David, is Donald Trump's not going to be here forever. That's the good news, David. He's going to be here for 2 more years or 6 years. Our country always goes on. And we shouldn't be insane about leaders are just passing through, but they can do a lot of damage while they're going through. But we have to realize that there's something bigger than a leader. That's why our leaders in federal government and the executive branch are term limited. So we can't sacrifice our values for a leader. You just can't do it. And there are certain things I disagree with the president, whether it was President Bush or President Trump or certainly President Obama. But I never debased the institution in my disagreement. And I think that's what we have to rise above. Our country is much bigger than any one person or any group of people. We are very resilient, and that's why I don't think, I always think the glass is half full.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that, let's go back to the original question, which is how do you, as a student, get information? Brad just gave you a really great idea, which is go into a situation where you're not comfortable. Go out of your comfort zone and hear how somebody else is going about it. You can find it online, you can find it on TV, you can find it in print. But, you know, I tell my son who's in college, take a class in an area that you're not sure you're good at, just to try it. I mean, you're at the stage of life now, you're not going to have this forever, where you can just try learning things for the sake of learning. And that is precisely the right attitude to take with your own self-education about current events or public policy or politics, whatever. Go out of your comfort zone and don't just stay in the echo chamber. Now, it will not surprise you to learn I do not support President Trump. I do not like his rhetoric. However, I'm from Wisconsin originally. And I can tell you that when you see a factory in a mid-sized city close, it's as violent to that community as a bomb going on. And it's happening all over the area where I grew up in south central Wisconsin. Factories are closed. People are desperate. And I would argue that if instead of saying, oh my God, how could Wisconsin go to Trump? What were they thinking? Ask, what were they feeling? How desperate do you think they were to cast that vote? And what were we as a country ignoring about that pain that would lead millions of people to do something nobody around Washington thought they would do? That's an important message. So instead of saying, oh my God, did you see the latest crazy thing the president said today? I think it's far more productive to ask, are people responding to that trade message because a bomb just went off in their town? That's to me, that's how I get around the, oh my God, I can't believe he just said that question. Now, I can't believe that someone who voted for President Trump in that situation is going to vote again in the same numbers, but we're about to find out in 3 weeks. This is the first test we'll have as to whether or not voters in a voting booth believe that this is the right answer. But we all have to accept the result, assuming, of course, as my friend mentioned, that there's been a fair process. We all have to accept the result. And that is what living in the country is all about. It's my hope that conversations like this become necessary beneath the Capitol dome because there's been a rebalancing of the allocation of power. But that all depends on if people vote. If you don't vote, you're part of the problem. Anyway, thanks for having us both tonight.